and then we'll jump right into it. Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful, beautiful morning. Thank you for this place that you have so graciously provided for us to meet together, to come and worship you. Father, especially on this day, the Easter Sunday that we specifically set aside to celebrate the resurrection of your Son, Jesus. And Jesus, our Lord, we are so grateful for your sacrifice, your gift, for the relationship that you paid the way for. And so, Father, on this morning, we invite you to meet us and to have your way. We invite you to be the one who brings the word and to have your way with what's said, what's heard. And Lord, we just ask that you bless us this morning and that you be blessed by us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So, let's start with a quick review of last week. So where we were was we did the Ten Commandments, and then we talked about Israel's response to the giving of the Ten Commandments. And we had the account in Exodus, and then we also had the account in Deuteronomy. But the gist of it is when they heard the word, they heard the thunder, they saw the lightning, and the earth was shaking, and they said, "This is amazing. We've heard the voice of God, and we didn't die. But let's not push our luck. Instead of all of us risking the chance of being destroyed by this awesome, mighty God, Moses, you talk to him, and then you just tell us what he said, and we'll just go with that." So they had the fear and trembling, and even God said, I wish that they would always have this heart where they respected me, where they honored me, where they treated me as an awesome God. So they, in that moment, they did really well. Then we go on from there to talking the proper use and making of altars, beginning with only to God. God is the only God and the only one there to worship. The altar should be made of earth, not with cut stones. Put an altar anywhere where God caused his name to be remembered. And then something practical, don't build it up high and where there's steps, because then you might be exposed. We went on from there to the proper treatment of slaves. Again, talking about their culture and our culture very different. Their idea of slavery not the same as what we're familiar with historically in our country. But there were certain limitations. If a Hebrew sold himself as a slave, then he served for 6 years and was freed on the 7th. If a servant decided that for one reason or another he loved his master and did not want to be freed, then he publicly went. They pierced his ear with an awl on the door jamb or doorpost, and that person became a lifelong servant or slave. But it was always a free will thing. It was because he said, "This master is, he's a better master to me than I am. I want my life to be devoted to this." And then there was also talk about proper treatment of them, and we get into more of this as we get into today's. But if you treated a slave improperly, then they were, depending on how you did it, they could earn their freedom through that. So then it talked about personal injury. We ended up talking about death for death. If you're a murderer, then you put to death. It's accidental. We had the cities of refuge. That gets much more detailed later on. Interestingly, though, if you got a murderer, then they talk about kidnappers, and kidnappers should always be put to death. And then talked about respecting your father and mother, neither to speak disrespectfully of them or to them, or to strike them, or you're in the same boat. It's a death penalty. Quick summary of last week. So this week we're in Exodus 21, starting with verse 18. We're picking up on the personal injury, and we're just going to go through it. So again, I'm in the NLT. Starting with verse 18. "Now suppose two men quarrel, and one hits the other with a stone or fist, and the injured person does not die, but is confined to bed. If he is later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery." I'm going to clarify, The not punished means, okay, he didn't die, so the assailant doesn't die. Now, the interesting thing here is if he's later able to walk outside again, interesting specification there, just that it's if he's able to walk outside again. It's like if he's, I don't know, maybe if he could only walk inside, I'm not sure. But I guess it's if he's able to move around and get around on his own. Even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but here's the thing, he must compensate the victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. There is a message here about God's idea of responsibility. Your body is your responsibility. That's your own personal domain. You do not have the right to harm someone else or to inflict damage to their body, to cause them losses. If you do that, you owe them. I mean, that's not your body. That's not, I mean, there's a very definite line that if you take something from someone, their ability to provide, then you are responsible to provide. And here's the thing is you provide for his full recovery. Okay, here we go, verse 20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club, this probably might be a rod or a staff or some sort of punishment like that, and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. Now, typically this is a life for life, because here's the thing about the slavery in there. They were technically personal property. That was what they purchased, but their life was not being sold. Their life is a spark that God gave them, and that wasn't even theirs to give up. What they were giving is a period of life, that service for that period of time, but they're never offering their own flesh, their own blood, their own life. That is not something that could be purchased. So if you beat them, you've just murdered someone. I mean, if you beat them to death, you've murdered someone and you have to be punished for that. There are other parts and other cultures, and even, well, not getting into that, but the idea that you've bought someone, that you owned even their life, so it was just your property. You could treat them like you didn't like a chair or something like that. If I don't like it, I can break it, throw it away. God says that's not the case. Life is his. Verse 21, but if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. Now here's the thing, and that sounds almost like it's contradicting what I was just saying, but if the slave has sold himself into this situation, what he has done is he has provided his service. The owner of the slave is responsible for the well-being, for the provision of the slave, this person. So if the owner has beaten the servant to where he can't function, then he's basically done himself out of the service. He's still got to feed, he's still got to provide for the recovery of the slave, but he's lost. I mean, it's not like he's got to pay the slave to compensate him for his wages, because those wages have already been part of a bargain. So it sounds like he doesn't have to compensate the slave, but really the thing is that those wages have already been paid. So what he's done is he's put himself out, and obviously there's personal injury here, but now he's got someone who's got to provide for that's providing nothing back. So it ends up working out, I won't say necessarily equally, but the scales are fairly balanced in the situation. Verse 22. Now suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely. Different versions of this say it different. Some say has a miscarriage, or it's basically she's forced to give birth. It says, if no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands, and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury: a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. Now, so if, for example, the woman is struck and she gives birth and the baby lives, no further injury, That means that this injury is going to involve both the woman and the baby, unborn and born. Now, this baby is expected to come. This is, obviously a life. But obviously, we're talking about like the wealth of a family had to do with the number of children that they had, their ability to provide for the household, for the family business. But also, let's just go back into this. It's, if this happens and there's damage, if the woman is injured, then there's going to be compensation for that. If she's injured in a way that her arm is broken, then the assailant arm is broken. If she's burned, then he's burned. If the baby is born and has a defect, then there's compensation there. Not even compensation, but there's retaliation. If the baby's arm or leg or whatever, if some harm has come to the baby, then that also is compensated isn't even the right word. That's punished, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This is a major idea, and I don't think I want to make it clear. God hasn't done this so that everyone can go around and like match bruises. Jesus explained this later on. This isn't about, okay, well, you hurt me, so I get to hurt you back. This is, if I hurt somebody, then I'm going to get that back. So I need to not hurt people. I need to be careful about how I treat people. Obviously, you get in a fight with somebody and you injure them, you've got to compensate them for that injury. So don't do that. The punishments are very severe to show how serious God is about it, but also to deter you from doing these actions, to think through your actions, to understand your own responsibility. One of the best ways to learn to not touch fire is to have touched fire. Because you touch hot, that hurts, I don't want to do that again. The idea of like spanking or even beatings is, if the consequence is severe, I'm going to change my behavior so I don't get that consequence. So a lot of the law is severe, partly to show God's holiness and His sense of justice, but also to convince these people, don't do these things. And I think this is also, I'm pretty sure this is a regularly used scripture to talk about the preciousness of life, unborn and born. Because, this is specified. This isn't just a woman. This is a pregnant woman. This is a very specific instance where that unborn life is a life. And if you cause that life to be jeopardized, it's going to be treated just like if you caused anyone else's life to be jeopardized. Verse 26. If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye, and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. He has the rights to the person's service. He has the rights to the person's lifestyle. He has the rights to the person's labor, ideas, all those things. He does not have the right to that person's body or that person's life. If you injure the eye, that's it. You didn't pay for that. So they call it quits, they call it even. If a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for a tooth. That's some expensive dentistry. Again, this is, I keep getting the same thing going in my head. It's kind of echoing in the background. It's that man and woman were made in the image of God. You have the right to their service in a contractual agreement, but you do not have the right to harm another person made in the image of God. There are legal exemptions there, obviously, in the act of judgment legally, or in the act of war that is legally prosecuted. But in a situation, person to person, brother to brother, sister to sister, however this works out, you don't have that right. And there's only so much of a person that you can purchase. So going on to verse 28. Let me check here. I got a little, okay. Sometimes the scripture will have a little bubble there, and I click it just to make sure that it'll give other options. And this one has, if an ox, and then it's got a footnote, it says, or bull or cow. Okay. But if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh may not be eaten. In such a case, however, the owner will not be held liable. This is God laying out things for responsibility. also his value of life. If an ox who you have limited control over, if an ox just goes crazy, I mean, it's a beast, you don't have control over its will, and it gores somebody, then that beast has taken a life, and it's life for life. That beast has to be put down. But also, I mean, you can't put it down in a way, you can't just like butcher the animal and eat the meat. That animal has taken the life of a human being. It has taken the life of someone created in the image of God. It is therefore, what's the term? It's devoted to destruction. You can't partake of this thing because it's done something that's wrong, that's evil. But because you have no control over the mind or the will of some dumb beast, the owner is not held liable. 29. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring. Like, this is obviously an angry animal. And the owner had been informed but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned and the owner must be put to death. It's one thing if something happens randomly, but if you know and you don't take care of it, you're responsible. God is very, very big on personal responsibility. Like, there are accidents, and accidents, they happen. But if you know and you don't do, you are as responsible as if you chose to do the thing. If you've got an ox that tends to gore, and you know that it does, and you don't prevent it, then it's the same thing as you sending that animal to do the deed. My kids frequently, like various situations, it's like, well, why did you do that? I said, well, I didn't mean to. I said, well, the problem is you didn't mean not to. I mean, it just happened because you didn't take precautions. You were going through and doing what you're doing, but you're not thinking of the consequences, and you're not taking actions to prevent those consequences. I know accidents happen, but some of them are avoidable if you'll think about it. And this is one of the things that God's saying is, you've got to mean not to. Like, I didn't mean for that ox to go gore and kill somebody. So yeah, but you didn't take any precautions. You knew there was a problem, and you didn't take any steps, so you're responsible. You didn't intend to avoid this. You just let it happen. You're responsible. It must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. However, the dead person's relatives, this is interesting, the dead person's relatives may accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. I think it's a really good thing to see where God has set up a precedent for redeeming a death penalty. Especially here on Easter morning. I've got just chills thinking about it. You can, in a case like this, there are opportunities to redeem a death penalty. There's always extenuating circumstances, or there can always be. And I would imagine that if the owner of the ox, and there's a lot of conjecture here, but if you've got somebody who's just reckless and careless, and this is a problem, the family of the deceased can know this and not even offer this possibility. Like, you're a problem, that ox is a problem, you're a problem, this needs to stop. But if you've got a situation where maybe the owner of the ox didn't have the means to take care of this, or they got this ox and it went crazy and there just wasn't time to make the preparations, to make the precautions. And then here we have the opportunity for the family of the deceased to show mercy, to see that, okay, this is not a person who's being like bad or irresponsible. This is a person who had, and like these people all have dealt with cattle. They all have dealt with crazy animals. They can know, they can understand. They might also be neighbors or friends, and they don't want this person necessarily to die, so they get to set the price of the demands. Like, okay, the ox has got to be put down. I know you're not the problem, but let's make this arrangement, and it'll be done legally. It'll be done before judges, done before witnesses. And again, this is another one of those situations where God's like, I desire mercy more than sacrifice. And also, when you go through the law, you see over and over again, like if this is something that happened deliberately, then it should be punished. If this is something that happened accidentally, then that needs to be understood as well. Justice isn't just about punishing wrong things that happen. Justice is about treating what happened rightly. And only God can determine rightly. In fact, several of the laws that come up, they actually, if they're not really sure what happened, they had to go to the priest and they had to seek God, and then whatever God said went. That would certainly simplify court proceedings. It's like, well, let's just ask God. And it's like, he's guilty. He's not guilty. Like, done. You don't need a jury then. Anyway, so the same regulation applies as verse 31. If an ox gores a boy or a girl, but if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins. Check the little note there. It says, Hebrew says 30 shekels of silver, about 12 ounces, or 342 grams in weight. And the ox must be stoned. 33, suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or a donkey falls into it. The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. So, I mean, you've dug a pit for whatever reason, an animal falls into it, you've got to pay for the damage that's done. You've got to pay for the loss. You're responsible because you were irresponsible. But, you know, you get to keep the dead animal. So, like, if an ox falls in there, yeah, you got to pay for it, and that person's compensated because this is an investment, this is part of their livelihood. But at least you, who didn't intend necessarily to cause this damage, you're not completely out. You've got the value of the price there. 35. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox, and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal. Again, keeping it balanced here. But if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation, a live ox for the dead one, but he may keep the dead ox. All right, going into chapter 22. Protection of property. This one, again, we're talking a lot about personal responsibility. This is you understanding that your actions have consequences, and that those consequences, they're yours. You are responsible for what you do. We frequently see things today where people blame their actions on someone else or something else, their circumstances, whatever. And there are obviously a lot of different things that can lead to someone acting a certain way, but ultimately in God's eyes, if you choose to do something, you made that choice and you've got the responsibility, the accountability. Let me see some here. Okay. Verse 1, if someone steals an ox or sheep and then kills or sells it, the thief must pay back 5 oxen for each ox stolen, and 4 sheep for each sheep stolen. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking into a house and is struck and killed in the process, the person who killed the thief is not guilty of murder. But if it happens in daylight, the one who killed the thief is guilty of murder. A thief who is caught must pay in full for everything he stole. If he cannot pay, he must be sold as a slave to pay for his theft. Let's stop and back up a little bit. Again, it's one of those times where I don't really understand how they separated the verses, because I mean, you end one situation and then start the next, but you didn't have a verse change. Don't guess that's really important. So we've got a thief breaking into a house, and if in the process of breaking in the house they're killed, then the owner of the house is not considered guilty of murder. Now, this is assuming the thief is sneaking in at night. If a person is sneaking in at night, they obviously don't want to be caught, but there are questions about their motives. I mean, they may just be there to steal, but they could be there to do more than that. They're obviously trying to, really hard to get away with this. It's something that you plan. You don't just wake up in the middle of the night, hey, I'm going to go rob somebody. But also, it's dark. I mean, they don't have light switches. They can just turn on lights and stuff. So there's a really good chance that if you're woke up in the middle of the night and you react to someone in your house, there's every reason to believe that you're in fear for your life and that you can't clearly see what's going on, so there's all kinds of reasons, so you're not guilty of murder. However, if this happens in broad daylight, where, for example, you can see the thief and potentially later on identify them, or there's just no excuse for not being able to handle this a better way. If it's happening in daylight, there's also the idea that, like, if somebody's doing this in broad daylight, again, this is conjecture, but I mean, you've got someone who's maybe acting impulsively. Their situation may be very, very bad, or they may just be stupid. I don't know. But the long or the short of it is, if there's enough light for you to be able to see them, then you don't have the right to kill them. Again, you catch them and then they compensate. I mean, their life is not worth, or at least what they've stolen is not worth their life. So you don't have the right to take their life. And the thief is caught, must pay in full for everything he stole. Now again, this is one of those situations where the consequence is severe. And this is, you've got somebody who's stealing. They're either stealing because they want more than they have out of greed or whatever, or they're stealing because they're desperate for some sort of help, or they need something, whatever. If the consequence is greatly superior or like far outweighs the benefit of actually doing, this is going to prevent people. If you realize, like, okay, shoplifting, for example. If someone shoplifted, say, a candy bar, and realized that the consequences of that would be to, like, pay the price for 5 of them, and you're not even getting anything in return. We're talking about paying for it and not getting it. It's got to be returned, and then you got to give them extra. It just keeps going on. You've got like this huge consequence. It's a great incentive to seek other options, to seek other possibilities. In fact, later on, as we go through, you start seeing if somebody is in need, you're supposed to help them. If someone needs a loan, don't turn them away, help them. And that comes up a little bit later. Let's see. Verse 4, if someone steals an ox or donkey or a sheep, and it is found in the thief's possession, then the thief must pay double the value of the stolen animal. So basically, if you can get the one that was stolen back, then they owe you double back. I think it's the case if they murder and basically if they've taken all the rights. If you've got an ox or a sheep and someone steals it and then they sell it, or they butcher it and they sell it, then all the potential that was there for that animal, further feeding of the animal, their own ability to haggle and negotiate a price, all that's been taken completely from them. However, if they get that animal back, that potential is still there, so they've still got all that value there, but the thief still has to pay above and beyond. Verse 5, if an animal is grazing in a field or vineyard, and the owner lets it stray into someone else's field to graze, then the animal's owner must pay compensation from the best of his own grain or grapes. Again, you got people. I was like, okay, I've got my grain, I've got grapes. I don't really want to spend my resources, so I'll just kind of bring them over here and they can eat over there. That doesn't cost me anything. When God's saying, yes, it does. And it's not just going to cost you, but you're going to have to replace whatever was eaten with the best of what you had. Again, you need to be responsible. You need to take care of your own. And you don't have the right to take advantage of somebody else. You must, if you take something, you pay for it. If you are burning thorn bushes and the fire gets out of control and spreads into another person's field, destroying the sheaves or the uncut grain or the whole crop, the one who started the fire must pay for the lost crop. You've got to take responsibility. You've got to take precautions. And even if it's something like an accident, there's still loss. There still needs to be compensation. Just because you had an accident doesn't mean that they should have to suffer the consequences of it. That had nothing to do with them. You started that fire, you're responsible. I think it's one of the things I'm trying to beat into my children's heads. You've got to be responsible. When you make a choice, you have got to live up to whatever comes from that, whether it's your fault or not. Life is not fair. Sometimes accidents happen. But if you are the one who sets something in motion, then you need to see that through till its proper fulfillment. And in that, life isn't fair, but God is. We need to trust God. Now, his definition of fair varies greatly from what we typically want to call it, but he is God. He is good. And if something happens accidentally, earlier on we read something, if something happens accidentally and the Lord allowed that to happen, I think it had to do with murder, allowed that accident to happen, you got to understand that, if God has allowed something to happen in your life, then it's an opportunity for him to do something. Now, it may not be fun, it probably won't be, but if we'll trust him and we'll submit the situation to him, he can be glorified in it, and what we may lose here on earth will gain in treasures in our Father's hands. Verse 7. Suppose someone leaves money or goods with a neighbor for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house. If the thief is caught, the compensation is double the value of what was stolen. But if the thief is not caught, the neighbor must appear before God, who will determine if he stole the property. So you got a situation, I'm leaving my goods here with my neighbor, I come back and the goods are missing. He says someone stole them. It's like, okay, well, if we find the thief and we can recover that property, obviously he's telling the truth, not his fault, that's the thief's fault. But if can't find any evidence of a thief, then we go to God and we ask God, it's like, was the stuff stolen or is this guy responsible? And then we trust God. Because sometimes a thief comes in and they steal something and they leave this nice present behind that I suddenly have that I didn't have before. But you can't hide from God. There's no mystery to God. He knows. I really wish they'd gone into detail on exactly how this was done. The Thummim and the Urim, I think I'm saying that right. They were two stones that were in the breastplate of the high priest, and they would use those. They would ask, they had a process that God had provided for them, but they would ask God for yes or no answers. And then they would pull these stones, and somehow these stones gave them the indication, and always right. I mean, you see it later on, like when they go into the Promised Land, when Achan stole some of the goods from Jericho, which God had said, destroy everything, don't take anything. They went through by lots, but through this process, and it was narrowed down from all the tribes to one tribe, to one clan, to one family, to one man. God set this up so they knew this worked. So this was part of their justice system, which is really kind of amazing. Let me see here. Okay, verse 9. Suppose there is a dispute between two people who both claim to own a particular ox, donkey, sheep, article of clothing, or any lost property. Both parties must come before God, and the person who God declares guilty must pay double the compensation to the other. This is really, it seems like a really good clue that, if you guys would just be decent and solve these issues among yourselves, you could settle this much more easily. Because if you claim something is not yours, it's better to just go ahead and own up to that, because if it has to go to God, God's going to call you out and you're going to own double. I mean, you're going to be worse off. And this being God's system, provided they're following God's path and his methods, it's always going to be right. You're always going to get caught. The incentive to just be decent is strong here. I mean, I can't even understand the mentality of somebody in this culture and under this law ever claiming something he knows isn't true. Because ultimately it's going to go to God, and God's going to say, liar. And I think that was God's point. It's like be nice to each other, be kind to each other, treat each other properly. I'll call you out on it. In fact, he says that several times too. Let's go to verse 10. Now suppose someone leaves a donkey, ox, sheep, or any other animal with a neighbor for safekeeping, similar situation, but it dies, or is injured, or is taken away, and no one sees what happened. The neighbor must take an oath in the presence of the Lord. If the Lord confirms that the neighbor did not steal the property, the owner must accept the verdict, and no payment will be required. So it's not, you left the stuff with your neighbor, something happened. By leaving the stuff with a neighbor, there's a certain amount of accountability on you because you chose this neighbor. And the neighbor accepts a certain amount of responsibility because they accepted that responsibility. However, if it's outside the person's ability to control, like the animal stumbles or just falls over dead, the neighbor has nothing, it's not his fault. So again, it comes to God says, this is his responsibility, this wasn't his responsibility. But if the animal was indeed stolen, the guilty person must pay the compensation to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the remains of the carcass must be shown as evidence, and no compensation will be required. If someone borrows an animal from a neighbor and it is injured or dies when the owner is absent, the person who borrowed it must pay full compensation. I don't borrow animals from people very often. I have been known to borrow vehicles, trailers, equipment, tools. I generally try really hard to make sure it comes back in as good, if not better, condition than when I borrowed it. But under this concept, under this the spirit of the law here, if we borrow something from someone and we're using it on our own and it's damaged, it's our responsibility to make sure that it comes back to them. You can't just use somebody's stuff and then it breaks and you return it to them broken because, it's not their fault. They did you a favor and you're basically doing them a disservice. Verse 15, but if the owner was present, no compensation is required. And no compensation is required if the animal was rented, for this loss is covered by the rental fee. Presumably if the owner's there, the owner has got the opportunity to say, don't do this because you're going to break my stuff, or don't do this, you're going to kill my cow. They're there to help run, to make sure they're supervising. They have the ultimate responsibility for the item that's being borrowed. And again, if it's rented, then presumably you have purchased that. And today, a lot of times you go to a rental place, there's insurance built into it, and it's usually a deposit to cover if some sort of damage is done. And you get the deposit back if you've done things properly, return it clean, return it in good working order. But if the big point here is that if someone is doing you a favor, don't let that cost them. Don't return evil for good. And again, be responsible. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I really would like to go ahead and starting at the beginning of chapters when we got into middles, but there's a lot in the next part that I want to start off with next time. So any comments, any questions, any thoughts on what we've talked about today?
If you borrow something, make sure the owner comes with you.
That is a good idea. Especially with tools and equipment. I have thought about borrowing some stuff and thought, I'm not really sure I know how to do this, and I don't want to learn on somebody else's stuff. Largely because I was raised understanding this. I think it's really important. There's so much to that. Don't just borrow tools from somebody. Have an experience with somebody. If that's their tool, they know how to use it. You've got the potential to learn from somebody who actually has the equipment. But you've also got the potential for fellowship to work together. And that's just better. I think so much of all of this is personal injury, personal property, but it all really comes down to personal responsibility and knowing how to treat other people. Despite their social status, their economic status, life is something that God has given. The body or that life is contained, that's a gift of God. And that's something that we need to respect, to honor. Even if the person who's living that life is not respectable, we need to honor and respect the God who gave them their opportunities. We need to honor and respect also that judgment, justice, and even vengeance, those are things that are in God's court. He's the one who ultimately determines guilt or innocence. In some situations, he lays it out. This is how things are. In the case of murder, if you're caught red-handed stealing, that's guilt. And this is my judgment for you, which is really pretty kind, because ultimately the judgment for all sin is death. And again, that's something that he was setting things up for. You go through the law and you see all these consequences. This is how this is done. This is how this is done. This is how the people are compensated. But I like to point out that all these things that have happened, this is how they compensate each other. This is how God has said, this is how you treat each other. There are still guilt offerings and sacrifices that have to be made. This may make it right with your neighbor or your victim in whatever case, or your victim's family, but you've still committed a sin. And so you get into Leviticus and you start seeing all the consequences that happen spiritually, that you have, like, this many animals have to die for these kinds of sins, or these kinds of offerings, or there's even an offering sacrifice for the unintentional sins or the unknowing sins. If you committed a sin that you didn't know about, then you're responsible once you found out about it. But also there's a sacrifice for the sins for everybody, because obviously, even though we have all these laws, you've probably done something you shouldn't have, and you just don't know about it, but you're still guilty. Ultimately, the law was to show the great gap between God's holiness, His righteousness, His goodness, and our complete inability to come close to attaining that. The laws were there to show His high standard, but also to show the inability of us to live up to that standard. And in the process, set up the pattern for Him to live up to it for us. I was thinking about this the last couple of weeks, and thinking about just looking at the books of Samuel and the Judges and all that, and how often Israel strayed from God. And not remotely trying to excuse it, but you just look at him and you just think they're stupid. I mean, why would they do this? Why? They've got God, they've got the presence of the Almighty. Why would they keep turning away from Him? And I think it's important, again, not to excuse, but to understand a little bit the burden that this law was for them. We know we've got Jesus, we've got his ransom for us. And so we're not under the burden of this. But can you imagine living day in, day out? Your entire culture is built around this law that Paul tells us later, the whole point of that law was just to show that we're sinful and that we can't help that. Their lifestyle, their culture, their celebrations, everything about it was about this law that they could not fulfill. And I'm not saying remotely that God's not just, or that God's was being unfair to them, but He was definitely being hard on them, because He had to be. Because if you don't know you need help, you don't ask for it. Now, He's also a gracious God, so every time they turned to Him, He took them back, which is amazing, because it happened over and over. The entire book of Judges is people finally just, I'm going to do my own thing. And they got themselves deep, deep, deep into trouble. They called out to God. God raised up a judge, brought them back, and then as soon as they had the opportunity, they went sideways on Him again. God was always there, always gracious, always faithful. His Word constantly talks about His unfailing love, which, when you realize how often they as a nation rejected Him, and He still called them back and still brought them back. But it just struck me that I don't have any idea what it must feel like to live under the burden, the weight of the law. And I know, I've shared this before, that I had a year or two where I was really digging into this, trying to figure out what God was doing in my life, and got so depressed just getting into this law and not reading it like we're talking about now, reading it as though this is what God demands. And it was miserable. It was absolutely miserable. And that was just a couple of years of surface study of the law. I think it's so important that we understand just how much freedom we've been given through Christ. It's not that we're free to sin, it's that we're free to get back up and step right back into His presence. That sin can no longer separate us from Him anymore. When you look, I think especially in the Levitical laws, the things that would exclude you from being part of the worship service, just being part of the act of worshiping God and the congregation. Everything from as little as like skin blemishes could potentially keep you out of His presence. Not being born in the right family, not like being illegitimate, you couldn't be part of the service of God. You could not join in the worship. If you had stumbled around and you touched something dead in the field, boom, you're ceremonially unclean, you're no longer fit, you can't go in. There's just so much that God was saying, like, you don't understand. You've got to understand how holy I am and how holy you're not. But you still need to strive for this. And then Jesus came along and said, I'm going to fix all of this. Behold, I make all things new. And He did. He changed everything. He didn't change the nature of God. He just fulfilled that nature. We still live in a fallen world. We still live in fallen flesh that we are called to die to daily. To not value this more than this. And I think in order to have a full sense of the true gratitude that we need to approach, we've got to know just what we're free from. We're not just free from sin. We're free from all the burdens of that sin. We can get back up, dust ourselves off, and the dust comes off. And that's because of Jesus. Next week we'll get into a little bit further. I'm really looking forward to getting back into the story part of this. But I have determined that God wants us to go through each step. I don't know exactly what it is that He wants to bring out of each of the piece of this, but I'm not going to miss it because I'm eager to get to the next part of the story. So next week we will pick up on verse 16 of 22, and we'll go from there. Any other questions, comments? In that case, go with God. Be blessed.